The life and death of Cardinal Bernard Law. From his arrival as Archbishop of the Boston Archdiocese in 1984.
I'm coming to Boston after 52 years of a lot of moves. I am coming to establish my final home. The apostolic delegate reminded me last night that after Boston there's only heaven.
Some would argue hell is more appropriate, as Law became the emblem of the Catholic Church sex abuse scandal and the decades-long cover-up.
Your own documents condemn you. You are a criminal. A murderer of children.
He was never held accountable. People like me and my family, we were left to pick up the pieces.
Despite the pain of those survivors and lingering outrage throughout much of the Catholic Church, it was announced today that Bernard Law will receive a full cardinal's funeral, complete with a final blessing from the Pope on Thursday at St. Peter's Basilica. The Vatican confirmed Law's death early this morning at the age of 86. It was almost 34 years ago that he first arrived in Boston, a Harvard-educated advocate of racial tolerance and social justice for the poor. His rise was meteoric. Some even believed he was on track to become the first American pope. That is, until May of 1992, when WBZ reported on accusations against Fall River priest James Porter.
The Channel 4i team has uncovered a chilling account of child rape and molestation involving a former Massachusetts Catholic priest and as many as 100 children.
Porter was eventually tried and sent to prison for child molestation, but then came word that another priest, John Geoghegan, may have been molesting children as well. In 2001, the Boston Phoenix started to dig deeper after Cardinal Law was named as a defendant in Geoghegan's case, and while they found disturbing details about Geoghegan's past, they couldn't prove that Law knew about it. Then came the Globe. In 2002, the Spotlight team fought for and won a trove of internal church documents proving what many had suspected. Law knew about Geoghegan, and he did nothing except transfer him to places where he could continue his assaults.
I knew that it was a good story, a very strong story, very powerful story, but I certainly didn't know that it would have the impact that it has had.
But impact it did, and at that point, Law had to respond.
Judgments were made regarding the assignment of John Geoghegan, which, in retrospect, were tragically incorrect.
Geoghegan, too, was ultimately convicted of indecent assault, but none of the more serious charges. By that time, though, the floodgates had opened, and we started to learn details of the accusations against Father Paul Shanley in Newton, and in a press conference held by an attorney representing Shanley victims, the world got to see the extent to which Cardinal Law allowed the priests to prey on children.
What you're not going to see in these records, and you're not going to see one of them, is any interest in supporting the many, many victims of Paul Shanley.
The Shanley file disclosures and Globe investigation led to Law's ultimate resignation, but even his departure was little consolation to many here in Boston as the church summoned him home to spend the rest of his life in the comfort of the Vatican. Joining me now are my Boston Public Radio co-host and Globe columnist Margery Eagan. Good to see you, who was a Herald columnist throughout Law's tenure here. Mike Rezendes was a member of the Globe Spotlight team during this investigation. Mike, it's good to see you. And Phil Saviano, of course, church abuse survivor, founder of the New England chapter of SNAP, Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests. Thank you all for being here. What was your first reaction, Phil, when you heard the news that Law was dead?
My first thoughts were for the emotional well-being of the survivors, who still bear a great deal of anger. I decided to wear my mourning suit today, not in recognition of the departure of Cardinal Law, but out of respect for the thousands of clergy abuse survivors who are so traumatized by their childhood experiences that they grew up to die of drug overdoses and alcoholism and suicide. Those people and their families are where my thoughts are today. Your
thoughts were also, I read, 25 years ago. There was an anniversary, was there not?
Yes, yesterday was the 25th anniversary of the day that I found my voice, and I drove down to the Boston Globe and I met with investigative reporter Steve Kirkjian, and for the first time spoke publicly about my own abuse.
How'd that feel when you said the words?
That morning?
Yeah.
You know, it was liberating. In fact, I have a recording of that whole interview, and looking back on it, I'm surprised that I started out being really anxious, but halfway through, I found my sense of humor. And it was a good experience for me after many years of silence.
What was your first reaction? You also had an anniversary, a 15th anniversary, correct?
Yes, this is really the 15th anniversary of the Globe Spotlight stories exposing the cover-up of child sexual abuse in the Boston Archdiocese. You know, I have to say, my first reaction was to remember the first morning that our first story came out, and I also remember the day that Cardinal Law resigned. And then after that, like Phil, I started to think about the victims, including a young man named Patrick McSorley, who was one of the first victims who spoke to me. He allowed me to use his name after our interview, and unfortunately, less than 2 years later, Patrick was dead. And I think the abuse he suffered at the hands of the aforementioned John Geoghegan was a big part of the reason.
What was your reaction, Margery? You covered this, and you're also a pretty good Catholic, I should say.
Well, I thought about the time I mentioned to you before. I visited Rome and got on the tour bus with my kids, and the second stop on those double-decker red buses they have in all the cities was the church that Cardinal Law went to in Rome, and I was stunned. I knew it was a big church. I had no idea. I think it's the biggest church next to St. Peter's in all of Rome, or it's close anyway, and it just struck me that he went on to a life of luxury and prominence in the Vatican, and it just was like realizing how the salt was rubbed into the wounds.
While the media was doing its job, there were people from the church to a woman who became the ambassador to the Vatican for the U.S. who weren't so crazy about the Globe's work in particular. Here's Mary Ann Glendon. I often hear it said that the Globe will receive a Pulitzer Prize for its reporting. All I can say is that if fairness and accuracy have anything to do with it, awarding the Pulitzer Prize to the Boston Globe would be like giving the Nobel Peace Prize to Osama bin Laden, so I guess he's going to get it. What was the reaction amongst, and I know you wrote a lot about this, amongst average Catholics like you and elite Catholics, the powerful Catholics in Boston, to the first news when you saw
Oh, my goodness, the whole political power structure was with the church.
Yes.
I remember late Senator Ted Kennedy, a very powerful guy, was with the church, Beacon Hill. The politicians, many of them were Catholics. The Cardinal had this big garden party every year that everybody went to that was of the movers and shakers. So there was huge denial.
How daunting was that for you and your colleagues at the Globe?
It was very daunting. I mean, it's easy to forget 15 years later that at that time the Catholic Church was the most powerful institution in the city of Boston. Boston was the most Catholic city in America, and it was a city of devout tribal Catholics. Law was a very powerful man in Boston, across the United States, and at the Vatican.
I wanted to, speaking of the Globe, Phil, you had a comment, I'm paraphrasing in this morning's paper, so much good he could have done.
Yeah.
It was squandered. I want to know why you think he did, and I also want to know why you all think he ignored people like Jackie, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Gavreau. This is from 2002.
He is a prince of the church. He is our spiritual leader. With all my heart, I believe this man. I stepped in front of him again. I said, "Do you remember me?" I said, "I'm Jackie Gavreau. I told you about Paul Shanley molesting children. Do you remember that?" And he said, "Talk to my bishops. That's why I have them."
Why didn't you listen to her, Phil? Why did he squander the opportunity you described that he had?
Well, that's one of the mysteries, as far as I'm concerned. Now, I was speaking to one of my colleagues this morning. She says, "Phil, don't you understand? The reason that he protected all these child molesting priests was because his goal was to become the next pope."
I think that's true, and I think it's more than that. I think Cardinal Law saw his job as protecting the church from scandal. Cardinal Law saw his job as protecting the institution, and he forgot about the people the institution was supposed to serve. I think this is not uncommon in very powerful institutions, by the way.
You're nodding in agreement with Mike.
Because I think they were obsessed with that, and I think that, many of us who grew up around here as Catholics, priests were pretty big deals. The bishop came to your house to see you, or you went to see it, you kissed his ring. There was this whole... And I don't think they had any idea that the damage and the harm that this was doing to children, because they were ignorant about it.
Why do you say that?
None of them had children.
Exactly.
Well, it's perfectly obvious why they were literally ignorant. I mean, this is the clergy is an all-male institution.
Operation.
All-male institution, no women priests, and priests do not have children.
Yeah. I think if there had been a different power structure in the church, I like to think that it would have been a lot different, the reaction. But maybe I'm wrong.
You know, I'm sorry, Phil.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
I always like to think if there had been a few women in those rectories, we wouldn't have had half the problems that we've ended up
Yeah,
with.
I like to think that too. And I also
could
think
say
there
that
was
about
such
some
a,
other places
there was
too,
such
by
a
the way. What's
bias.
that?
There was such a bias. I remember covering two brothers who accused a priest. This is before all this came to fore about Porter and everything.
Yeah.
And the jury was, oh, these guys just want money. They just want money from the Catholic Church. So there was this idea that kids were making this up.
Sure. Was there any? Do we have any idea? Margery described, living in the lap of luxury there, and that's the sense I get, almost like a reward for leading this pedophilia ring or whatever you want to call it. Do we actually know what Law's life was like in those remaining years in Rome, or no? I know a lot of reporters tried to interview him, literally tried to chase him down with virtually no success. Do we know anything?
Well, I think we do. I mean, I happen to know a church lawyer whose uncle had the same position as Cardinal Law before Cardinal Law.
Oh, really?
So I had a description of the life that Cardinal Law lived, and it was a sumptuous life of luxury. I would like to add that in addition to living a pretty nice life, Cardinal Law also maintained a lot of influence and a lot of power at the Vatican.
Like over what kinds of things?
Well, he continued to hold a very influential position at the Vatican. He was behind the investigation into American nuns. For instance, he was behind the investigation into the American nuns. He led we now know from the WikiLeaks data dump, we know that Cardinal Law led a secret mission to Vietnam to open up diplomatic relations between the Vatican and Vietnam. So this was a very influential, powerful, trusted person within the Vatican.
I want to talk about another influential person who has a position of great power, the current cardinal here, O'Malley. About 4:30 this afternoon, he had a press availability. Here's some of what he said.
Initially, it's a moment of pain, but hopefully out of this, it will help to remind all of our Catholics that this is not something that has been solved of the past, that right now the hurt is still there, the healing is still necessary, and we must all be vigilant.
You know, Phil, we must all be vigilant. He is the man who could lead the vigilance. He's the chair of the Pontifical Commission on Protection of Minors.
Right.
My understanding is both survivors who are in that committee. One voluntarily left and the other one is gone for whatever. How's he doing in that incredibly powerful role?
He's a complete wipeout.
Meaning what?
Well, I really think that organization, was announced with great fanfare and got a lot of people hopeful, but I don't think that it was ever meant to do anything, and it clearly hasn't done anything.
Exactly.
They talked about having some sort of tribunals to hold bishops accountable, bishops that have protected pedophiles, but that never
So it's just like a waiting game? It's just sort of...
I think it's a waiting game.
A waiting game.
Yeah.
What's your reaction?
Well, the panel was, the commission was on panel 3 years ago. Its term has expired, and it has done literally nothing except sit and talk. And issue nice statements, but it literally has done nothing. And as Phil said, there was a commitment from the Pope to establish a tribunal to hold bishops accountable, bishops who covered up for the abuses committed by their priests. And the tribunal was scuttled. Some changes were made in canon law, but bishops are still not being held accountable for the cover-up.
Before you leave, I mentioned Pope Francis is going to be at the funeral tomorrow. What's your reaction to that, Margery?
Well, I guess I'm not surprised that he's going to be there. I wish it was not going to be the full regalia funeral, which I've heard about. I think we could very quietly hold a very quiet and unsumptuous funeral mass and put him in the ground.
Quickly, what's that going to do for survivors when they see the Pope?
You know what I think? I think it's disgusting, and I think it's a slap in the face to survivors. And I wonder, what is the message that he's sending with this sumptuous going away party?
I'm with you, Phil Saviano. Margery, good to see you. You're sticking around. Mike, thanks so much for your
Always
work.
a pleasure.
So nice
Phil,
to be
as
here.
always.
Thanks.